Folks, my name is Phil Tourney. I'm a survivor, of course, most of you know, of the deliberate attack on our ship 45-plus years ago, June 8, 1967, by the State of Israel. 34 of my shipmates were slaughtered. 174 others were wounded, including myself. Our ship was in international waters doing what our government had ordered us to do, and that was to pick out and relay messages out of the sky, which is perfectly legal, and send it back to the National Security Agency. Now, our ship was one of the most sophisticated intelligence-gathering spy ships in the world at the time. We could bounce messages off the moon to National Security Agency within seconds. So you can just imagine back 45 years, the technology we had then. Can you imagine what we have now? It is light years into the future. But folks, the reason I do this show is in honor of the men that lost their lives that day, doing what they were ordered to do by their government, the United States of America. And then we were attacked by an ally, stabbed in the back. They almost sunk our ship. We had over 850 cannon and rocket holes in our ship, 5,000 armor-piercing bullets, napalm burning us up. They had 3 torpedo boats. They fired 5 to 6 torpedoes at us. One hit the starboard side, instantly blowing to bits 25 brave American Marines and sailors. 25 of them instantly dead. This torpedo was so explosive it picked the ship completely up out of the water and slammed it back down into the ocean. We immediately started listing to the starboard side. At that point, I thought the ship was going to roll over. The torpedo gunman would shoot at our firefighters and stretcher bearers and use this as target practice. I know this is hard for a lot of people to hear, but it's the truth, folks. It's just what happened. The United States government recalled rescue aircraft that were coming to our aid. They left us out there alone in this 2-hour attack that lasted as long as the attack on Pearl Harbor. We were sitting ducks and had nothing to fight back with. If we wouldn't have got a message out, fortunately by one of the sailors aboard the ship, Terry Haldebardier, within 15 minutes, they knew we were under attack. President Johnson would not send rescue aircraft. He recalled them and said that he didn't care if our ship was sunk and all hands went to the bottom of the ocean. The reason I do this show, and I do it from my heart, I do it with great honor for my dead shipmates. And I also do it for scorn for the people that covered up and have been covering up for the last 45 years. Folks, these men did not deserve to die at such a young age and be left alone by their own country, be killed, to be slaughtered. We put our last 3 life rafts into the water. The Israelis would have none of that and blew them out of the water and took one of them aboard their boat as a trophy. So that's kind of the rundown of what happened aboard the USS Liberty in the 45 years that we've been trying to get the truth out. So this never happens again. You know, we're all human. We all live on a small planet, and we all deserve the dignity to live and die, not to be murdered by anyone, regardless who they are. It is certainly my honor and great pleasure to welcome you aboard. Your voice counts. And, sir, I'd like to first start out by asking you, what are your thoughts now about the USS Liberty, and what were your thoughts then when we were attacked 45-plus years ago?
Well, first, thanks for the invitation. I'm really pleased and honored to be with you. When the Liberty was attacked, my first assumption was that this has got to be deliberate. There was, even on the basis of the rudimentary information that was released in the United States, internationally, in Israel, it was pretty clear it couldn't possibly have been an error. My initial assumption was that probably the reason for the attack was to conceal Israeli plans, which were then secret, to attack and conquer the Syrian Golan Heights after the ceasefire, the official ceasefire in the June 1967 war. These initial suspicions have been mostly confirmed by what's come out since, including what I didn't know at the time at all, the scandalous refusal of Washington, the Defense Department and the executive to come to the rescue of the Liberty. As I don't have to tell you, there were initial efforts to respond to the attack, but they were pulled back. And then came along a series of denials and evasions, which I'm sure all of you know about a lot better than I do. And it's basically, my general feeling is that my initial speculation was probably more or less accurate.
I think it's very accurate. And in your view, sir, you believe that the United States and Israel were in collusion to sink our ship and blame it on a foreign government such as Egypt.
Yeah. Well, I don't think that we know. I think there was collusion to cover it up. There was collusion not to prevent it. But I doubt that they were in collusion to actually implement the attack. I suspect that came as a surprise to Washington.
Sir, you know, what has been so disheartening to the crew of the USS Liberty, in fact, on my show here, I've had many Jewish people come on the air and conclude that the attack on our ship was not a mistake. It was a deliberate attack. And then we've had other people call the survivors, Nazis, Jew haters, people of not goodwill. And that isn't us at all. I mean, we didn't fire a shot. We didn't hurt anybody. We didn't kill any Israelis. We didn't do anything like that. Our goal has just been trying to get the truth out to the American public, so this piece of history does not go down as it's written now, or really not written, as a mistaken identity. And for people to call us names is completely shameful and uncalled for. And I just wonder how you would respond to how perhaps we could get a better reception with our goals in getting the truth out.
Well, first of all, calling names when you don't have arguments is a pretty old tradition. In fact, it's kind of striking that the concept of being what's called anti-Semitic or hater of Israel or something, that actually goes back to the Bible. There's an interesting biblical source. People who know the Bible ought to be aware of it. There's a particular figure of evil in the Bible, King Ahab. He's the peak of, he's the epitome of evil in the Bible. And he was condemned. His actions were condemned by the prophet Elijah. He criticized the acts of the evil king, his criminal activities, the actions he was carrying out that threatened the survival of Israel, and so on. Prophet Elijah was what we would call today a dissident intellectual. The term prophet is a misleading translation of an obscure Hebrew word. And the King Ahab, according to in the Bible, in the Book of Kings, called Elijah to him and denounced the prophet Elijah as a hater of Israel. Why? Because he was condemning the acts of the evil king. So there's a tradition that goes far back, and many examples since. In fact, you should feel honored by being placed in the company of the prophet Elijah, one of the heroes of the Bible and later tradition. But it's a familiar procedure. If you can't give arguments against someone, then vilify them, charge them with, try to undermine their reputations. That's pretty standard. Everyone who's critical of Israeli policies in a serious way is going to be subjected to this. It's the standard reaction when you can't respond to the arguments. It's not just in this case, it's in many cases. Soviet commissars denounced Russian dissidents the same way. Iranian clerics today condemn the dissidents, the critics like Shirin Ebadi and others as people who are anti-Iranian and so on. That's normal. Shouldn't be surprised. The real question is how to deal with it. My feeling is that the way to deal with the condemnations is basically to ignore them. They're beneath contempt. The real issue is to try to reach the public with the truth of the matter, just as you and your associates have been doing. And it's a hard sell because you're criticizing not only Israel, which you could probably get that across, but there's the role of the U.S. government, which was utterly scandalous. And that's harder. There are many protective barriers set up against a serious criticism of government crimes. That's not only true in the United States, it's true elsewhere too, but that doesn't make it any easier. It's hard work. I mean, you can give innumerable examples. I mean, you mentioned the Vietnam War, for example. When how the war began is barely even known. So, for example, take the war.
Sorry, Professor. We got one more break, and we got a long run, and we'll be back just a few minutes so you can finish your thoughts. And thank you for hanging on. And so welcome back, folks, to Your Voice Counts with Professor Chomsky, and I thank you very much for holding on and putting up with the breaks, which we all have to do to keep this show on the air. And so it's just one of those things that happens. And I was just thinking why the break was going on about the current things, and I know you didn't get a chance to finish your last thought, but the current events of today, of what went on or is going on, the Prime Minister of Israel comes to the United States and gets 29 standing ovations in front of Congress, which none of our presidents has ever gotten. And there's a lot of support in Congress for the state of Israel. And, I think that the Zionist state, as it stands, I'm afraid that we're trying to, or they're trying to get the United States involved in some kind of a war with Syria and not only Iran. And then I figure it's going to be hell on earth. And I just, what are your thoughts on that, sir?
Well, about the support in Congress, there's actually quite a lot to say. It's quite an interesting topic. It was pretty interesting to watch the Hagel hearings, which I'm sure you followed. If you notice what happened, the Republicans were unanimously and almost passionately in opposition to him, primarily on the grounds that he'd been they claimed too critical of Israel, also that he wasn't strongly enough advocating harsh measures against Iran, maybe war against Iran, and so on. The Democrats, on the other hand, were 100% in support of him. Now, that's kind of interesting and revealing. If you take a look at votes and money, Jewish votes go overwhelmingly to the Democrats. Jewish money funding, campaign funding, goes overwhelmingly to the Democrats. There's a couple of exceptions, like Adelson, for example, but that's been the pattern for a long time. Nevertheless, it was the Republicans who were the most strongly passionate about their undying love for Israel. That's not unique. It's extreme, but not unique. And it tells us something. It has to do with changes that have taken place in the Republican Party. The Republican Party has moved very far to the right in recent years. The people who used to be called moderate Republicans are almost not there. In fact, most of them are by now mainstream Democrats. People like Richard Nixon would be way to the kind of left fringe of the Republican Party if he were alive. Eisenhower would be off the scale. That's an important change, and one of the aspects of this, kind of a consequence of the shift to the right, was that the Republicans have turned to a different base of support, and that base of support is, to a substantial extent, Christian evangelical. And if you look at the Christian evangelical movement, right-wing Christians, which is a huge number of people in the United States, they are almost fanatically supportive of Israel, not because they like Jews. On the other hand, this is combined with an extreme kind of anti-Semitism of, their doctrines. Support of Israel is supposed to lead to a war with the Arabs, and that'll lead to Armageddon, and everyone gets destroyed, and the souls who are saved, who've found Jesus, rise to heaven, and all the others, including the Jews, go to eternal damnation. Actually, for some reason, 144,000 Jews will convert in time. They'll find Jesus in time, and they'll be saved. But the rest are essentially destroyed. Now, that's ever since 1948, particularly, this movement has gained enormous force in the United States, and has been highly supportive of Israeli aggression, the occupation, in fact, anything that will lead to provoking a war. They've even tried to blow up the Temple Mount. We were stopped just in time. That links up with something else. There's a long tradition of Christian Zionism, elite circles. Christian Zionism goes back to Britain. It actually long precedes Jewish Zionism. Also based on, readings of the Bible. The Bible is supposed to say that God promised Abraham that his people would settle the land. And Christian Zionists believe that. And that's people at high places. Like in England, say, Lord Balfour, the author of the Balfour Declaration, that authorized Jewish colonization in Palestine. It included people like Woodrow Wilson, Harry Truman, and others. It's a big force. And that's a force that's now becoming far more influential because of the changes that have taken place. The Hagel hearings were a striking example of it. Now, that's not the main reason for the extreme support of Israel. It goes back, there's a long story, there's probably no time to go through it, but it really traces back to 1967, just at the time of the Liberty attack. In the 1967 war, Israel performed a considerable service to the United States and its ally, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is where most of the oil is, and it's also the most extreme radical fundamentalist state in the world, and a very close ally of the United States, just as it was of Britain before it, because of the oil, its main energy resource. Now, at that time, Saudi Arabia was in a conflict, in fact, a war, a proxy war, with Egypt, which was the center of secular Arab nationalism, Nasser's Egypt. And the U.S. and Britain were bitterly condemned Egypt. They were concerned that secular nationalism in the Arab world might threaten Western, mainly U.S. domination of the huge oil resources of the region. Okay, Israel smashed secular nationalism, pretty near destroyed it, and protected Saudi Arabia, Islamic fundamentalism. And at that point, U.S. policies towards Israel changed sharply. They became they basically gained their current form, which is unique in world affairs, overwhelming support, economic, military, diplomatic, every dimension. And, the Liberty scandal has to be looked at in that context. And that goes on till the present. By now there are very close military intelligence links. The U.S. high-tech industry, like, say, Intel, the main chip manufacturer in the world, invest in Israel. It's kind of a rich Western country with extremely high inequality, but a highly educated technical force. Just to give you one example, one of the WikiLeaks exposures listed places on the globe that are of supreme strategic significance to the United States. Not a lot of them, I think maybe a dozen or two. One of them was right near Haifa in Israel. It was the Rafael military industries. They're one of the industries that pioneered, among other things, the development of drones. And they're very close. They're so closely linked to U.S. military industry that they actually shifted their management to Washington, which is closer to the funding. And there's a lot like this, which leads to very strong relations. It's now supported by sort of cultural factors like the ones I mentioned, Christian Zionism. There's a significant Jewish lobby, but I don't think it's the main factor. So that's in the background. Now, actually, I'm sorry, but I lost track of the other part of your question while I was going off on this.
Actually, the other part of the question that I was thinking about was, of course, the Christians in this country that support Israel fanatically, as you said, probably more than anybody else, is a very driving force. Not only in my small community, which there's probably more churches than anything else, and they're all pro-Israel, and that isn't. That has been, I think, somehow bred into them by the Hagels of the world and Pat Robertson and people like that, in a very unique and a very smart manner, because it all turns into to money for Israel. But with that in mind, we do have several callers that want to talk to you badly. And if you wouldn't mind, sir, would you mind taking a couple calls for me?
Sure, that's fine. Okay,
James?
Yes.
Hey, welcome to Your Voice Counts. And Professor Chomsky, what's on your mind today?
Well, first of all, let me say the professor is just a delight to listen to what he has to say, such intelligence. And I just want to say that I've been a supporter of the USS Liberty for many years now. I served over 30 years in the United States military. What I did want to ask the professor was on this. He did mention about military aid to Israel and what's going on in Haifa and locating their headquarters in Washington, because that's where the funding is. What I would like to know, Professor, is we have an agreement and we have an assistant act, which is called the U.S. Arms Export Control Act.
That's right.
Now, this act prohibits any assistance to any country which engages in a consistent pattern of human rights violations. And I'm talking about demolishing homes. I'm talking about confiscating property. I'm talking about limiting travel, checkpoints. and all of these human rights violations, but mainly the targeting of innocent men, women, and especially children, assassinations. Now, these violations are a direct violation of the U.S. Arms Export Control Act. And the United States has a right to ensure that our aid is not supporting actions by any government that undermines prospects for peace. Why isn't and why doesn't Congress hold hearings to examine Israel's compliance?
Well,
and I would, since we have something on the paper, since we have something in the act, I know it's an obstacle because of the media's control. And when I say control, I'm saying that it just seems that the media is continuously sheltering any bad news on Israel. And once again, why don't we have somebody investigate this violations of the U.S. Arms Export and Control Act? Because we're giving Israel over $3.2 billion of military aid each and every year. Now, we haven't heard anybody in these discussions of our budget problems ever discuss cutting aid to Israel. We've discussed cutting aid, or we've discussed cutting spending almost everywhere except the aid that we give to Israel. And so once again, my question is, why don't we enforce this U.S. Arms Export and Control Act?
Well, your point is very accurate, and in fact, it's been brought up for quite a while by the major human rights organizations. The Human Rights Watch years ago called on...
Can I just mention one other thing? Speaking about the Human Rights Control Act, we recently had the State Department conduct a report on human rights practices covering Israel and the occupied territories, which detailed widespread Israeli human rights violations committed against Palestinian civilians, many which involved the misuse of U.S. supplied weapons.
That's correct. And as I was saying, Washington's insistence on ignoring its own laws, as in the Export Control Act, has been condemned not only by individuals like you and like me, but even by the major human rights organizations. Human Rights Watch years ago brought up exactly what you did and called on the U.S. to observe its own laws. Amnesty International called for an arms embargo on Israel. But it's ignored, and the reasons are pretty much what I said before. There are very strong relations that are maintained, partly for strategic and economic reasons, partly for cultural reasons, and these simply overwhelm the voices of protest, not only from individuals like us, but from the major human rights organizations. This is incidentally not the only case, but you're right in bringing it up. It's a pretty striking case. And the only answer to that is to work harder to overcome it.
We do have another caller on, James Morris from California. And, respectfully, James, I introduce you to the Professor Chomsky, and go ahead with your call, please.
Professor Chomsky, thank you for coming on the show. Much appreciated. I had some questions for you, though, sir. You and I have met a couple of times, once in West L.A. It was right around the time the Iraq War was about to be launched, and I'd mentioned JINSA to you, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, the JINSA Neocons, and you knew full well what that was, because you responded by saying, did I hear what Woolsey, the former CIA director, had said recently on television? He's associated with JINSA, and has even said that he held up the Presbyterian wing of JINSA. Now, Colin Powell has also conveyed in the biographical book about him by Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post that the JINSA crowd was in control of the Pentagon, basically. And we know that from the clean break agenda that the Iraq War was based on. My question to you is, you've been very good in being critical of Israel, but you don't like to touch on the Israel lobby influence, not only GINZA and the Neocons, which are the upper echelon of the Israel lobby, but also AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt wrote about in their excellent book, The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. And you seem to downplay that, and I even heard that this now with regard to the Republican Party. You mentioned the Christian Zionists, which I agree they have influence on the Republican Party, but not nearly the amount of influence that the neocons have. And we saw that with the Hagel nomination. It was opposed by the neoconservatives. Again, keep in mind the traditional Republicans like Brent Scowcroft, Brzezinski, who was a Democrat, of course, realists, are against this neocon hijacking of the Republican Party. Yet we saw how powerful the neocons were with this Hagel nomination. They basically almost shot it down via their mouthpieces like John McCain and others. And again, let me pose the question, why do you deliberately downplay the influence of the Israel lobby, the neocons, AIPAC, and similar, and you won't debate Jeff Blankfort, who's been on Phil's program before? He's a leading anti-Zionist Jew. He's very familiar about the influence of the lobby, and you refuse to debate him. And lastly,
okay, let's give him a chance to go ahead and respond to that, James. We just got just a couple of minutes, please.
Thanks for taking my call.
Well, first of all, I agree with you completely about the neocons, but that's not AIPAC. The neocons are a mainstream force within conservative American, what's called conservative American thought. Go way back, sort of strongly rooted in the Reagan era and come right up to the present. And you're quite right that the neocons were they were the dominant force in the George W. Bush administration, and they pushed through the Iraq War over plenty of objections, huge public objections, even objections in the government and Congress. So sure, the neocons are tremendously important.
And there's also crossover, Professor Chomsky, between neocons who founded AIPAC, like Richard Pearl, and who are part of GINZA, the Jewish Institute for National Security. There's crossover between them, too. So they're both one and the same, basically, in many areas. Richard Pearl? Douglas Feith?
We got to go right now.
Rumsfeld and Cheney are not part of AIPAC, and they were way more significant than Richard Pearl. As far as AIPAC's concerned, sure, you're right. It's a lobby. It's an ethnic lobby, has some power. I think that Walt and Mearsheimer greatly misinterpreted its role. Yeah.
All right, we got 10 seconds. I want to thank you, Professor, for coming on for public broadcasting. Your voice counts. Thank you, everybody, for calling in. God bless America.